test3d.com with Project Dog Waffle, Howler 9.1 at this time, and it's time to start exploring some of the great features that you may not have seen before. I'd like to show you in this tutorial some of the techniques I used to create this sort of a big bang, a supernova explosion, make it what you want it to be. It's a lot of different techniques and filters combined. In fact, you could, for instance, also, instead of having it explode, you might want to reverse it and have it implode. So that's one of the first things I wanted to show you, is that you can, once you have done your animation, you can reverse this. You can do frame level editing in a couple of ways. Under the animation menu, you have the frames, and so that's where the frame level editing is, where you can cut frames. You can select the in and out marker and then copy or cut or delete the block of the frames between those markers, insert the block somewhere else. You can also right click and get the same menu here, and you can reverse the frames. That's one of the things you can do right there. So that is what will make it look like it's imploding, like so, rather than exploding. So if you play this, it's very dark at first. I have a little bit of blur on it too, so that makes it harder to really see the fine detail. That's really something you can play with as well. So, but here you see some alternating, flashing, bright glow or flare options, and then in the end it kind of all gets mushy and blurry as the soup comes in. It gets one proton soup. It gets to be one proton, electron, neutron soup as it goes nuclear. And there's some big blast. Okay, so how do we do this? How do you create this? You know, there are a couple of different techniques, and I wanted to show you one technique that I used in this particular case. All right, so first of all, I started from not a white image. If I erase it, it's white by default. Make sure you toggle the two here on the lower left. You have the primary and secondary color. You can simply toggle them like that and click that to erase it to black, or you can right click and erase it to black like this. Well, it erases the selected area, the selection, and by default everything is selected. So then the next thing I'll do is I'll create an animation of, you know, for starters, maybe just 30 frames. And those 30 frames are now all black, as you can see here. Alright, so the filter I used for this explosion of particles is, in this case, a different one that you may have seen before. This time I went to the animated confetti. Alright, the animated confetti collection. Alright, so what this one does is to generate a bunch of particles that will fly in different directions, and you can click the preview here to see them without actually rendering them into your frames. So that's a good starting point. When you go, it's actually rendering them into the frames. So one thing I'd like to do, first of all, this is very short-lived. I need the lifespan to be a little bit longer. I mean, I have 30 frames. Yeah, that's not a very long lifespan to begin with. The lifespan is actually longer now. I have 40 units for 40 frames or timestamps, and I have only 30 frames, so actually right there is probably a good idea to start with a little bit more. Let's give it 3 seconds, so that'll be at 90 frames a second. If I go with that, I could go and enter the number of seconds, and I say I want 3 seconds. Okay, that, and so we get 90 frames. You could also just enter that directly there. Tells you how much memory you need. That depends a bit on the dimensions, on the size, width and height of your image. And let's go. So we have 90 frames. And if I render that again in the preview, it's a little bit longer lived now. I see all of the 40 frames, but I have 90 to go for, so let's give it that. Right? So it's a little bit longer. I want it to be brighter, so perhaps initially I'll have a very light blue for one color, and then some other color. This is actually, I don't think this is a transition color. This is more like some particles are that color, some other particles are another color. Well, let's find out. Let's go preview that. A bit hard to say, but I think there are indeed some green appearing there, so probably a mix of yellow and blue. We can also have the particles be some sort of shards, and preview that, so they're little triangles, and we can make them bigger. Let's give them like 33. I think we can go to about 50. Let's go to 55. Yeah, 50 is where it caps it. So most of these parameters here are being capped somewhere. Preview that. Let's go back to the particles, see what that looks like. Little circles, okay, filled circles. Now the particles seem to be initially exploding or emanating from a central point, and then gravity pulls them down. So there is a gravity parameter here that if you set it to 0, they're not doing that, right? Whereas if you set it to, let's say, 5 or higher, they're falling down much faster. So in this case, I want to build some sort of an explosion in space. So I'm going to say gravity 0, so that they expand and keep expanding. There's also a feathering effect you can do. Let's see how high we can make that one. Yeah, so it's kind of feathered circles rather than very crisp ones. If you give it 0 feather, it's very crisp circles. If you give it, I don't know what the maximum value is. Let's see. Oh, 20. It's very soft. It's a very soft circle. So or feathered. Let's give it 5 or so. And let's see what else we can do with that. Explosion force. Okay, so if we give it very little explosion, it's not going to expand very fast, right? So here it is where we can go and make it a little bit faster or way faster. Explosion force. Let's see what's the maximum value for this one. Well, looks like we can go much higher. Let's see, 100. Okay, so the maximum is 100. So this one goes really far, maybe too far. Let's give it 44. And there you go. All right, so we'll do that. Now there's also a count parameter here on how many particles you can put in, and that one you can go really high. Let's give it 5,000, over 5,000 even. So, well, that's a little bit too big now because the particles are big, so I'm going to reduce the particle size to 5. So now we have even the really small ones, let's say 2, and barely any feathering. There you go. So we have a little bit more of a particle size for, let's see what looks shards. Okay, all right, so let's say we want maybe not quite that many. 777. There you go. Lifespan. So now here we have only 90 frames right now, but we could go to higher. We could go, let's say, 234, and we will ultimately actually go to 234 frames. We'll change that. Explosion force, maybe not quite that much. Let's see if we can make it even a little bit less. 11. Let's see what happens with 5 or 6. Okay, so we have something like this. Gravity, we saw we didn't want. The zoom factor. Now, if we zoom in really strongly, 7777, we get to see those particles really up close, but we don't get to see many of them because most of them are out of our field of view so quickly. So what you want to do is reduce it to 55. Now we're having an interesting scenario because we end up having a really wide angle. I mean, extreme wide angle. Look at that. And that, in a way, could be perhaps something that you use for some sort of a warp speed, jump into the, some sort of a tunnel that will make you travel through time and space, all sorts of different effects you can do. In fact, one thing to do with that is to use it to create some funky animated brushes that do some really interesting, bristle distribution. They expand and so on over time, so you can create animated brushes and pick them up like that. The zoom factor, we'll probably go with about 100. Let's give it 99. And there you go. Let's use that. Let's make the particle size a little bit bigger this time. And a little bit more feathering. Alright, so that's an idea of how you can work with these parameters. There's also the placement. And so if you place it, let's say, by default 00 is here and then 1000 is away from the camera. But if you give it, let's say 5000, it's going to be far away there. If you give it very close, 55, you're right in it, or very close up front, in front of you. I think you can give it negative values. I'm not sure. Yeah, you end up you actually now have the explosion behind you, and some of the particles come from behind and start showing up. But that's interesting if you have, let's say, if you have it very far away, minus 5,000, you will barely see any. Yeah, there's nothing showing here. Let's try 2,000. Still nothing. And 1,000. There's a few here now. So the camera, the camera is fixed, but what's happening is that, or maybe the camera is moving, I don't know. But anyway, relative to where the explosion is, you have control here of what you see. And I'm going to give it, let's try 0, right where the camera is. Well, yeah, so it looks like it's right there. It's not moving. I mean, they're getting smaller and farther away, but you see half of them right from the beginning, and that's it. Let's give it 3, 3, 3. Okay, so now there's one more parameter that's interesting to play with. It's whether there is collision. Now, collision with what? And well, that collision is with a ground floor, and by default you have it at a Y200, somewhere around down here, and an absorbance level. Preview that. You see some of the particles are coming back up, and I'm going to make it perhaps a really strong absorbance. So they actually stay there, but they still expand. Or you can make them sticky so they stop expanding and then they stick to the ground once they have hit that, or once they have stopped bouncing. Because if you have a very low bouncy parameter here, the absorbance, you can still see them bounce for a little while, but eventually some of them will be sticky and stay on the ground. So there's some interesting options there. We could make that 0 to see stick on the ground right there. Let's give them the sticky parameter. There you go. So some of them will never hit the ground, and that's why they keep flying here. Let's say plane 300. That's way down there. You still see some of them bouncing back up. Let's see if 400. Yeah, so I probably will go without collision in this case, and I'm going to go with particles. Let's preview that. There you go. It doesn't matter whether you have sticky or not, because collision is the overriding factor. It doesn't hit the ground. It's not going to care whether it's a sticky ground or not. So let's say here we have the parameters that we want for that sort of explosion. And let's go render that. All right, so now we have an interesting animation here. There's a little side effect at the end. Let's go actually kill this confetti. We're done with that. So let's have a look at this animation. We have let's see it at 100% size and play it. So there is a strange effect at the very end. The last frame is not really usable. We're going to delete that right there. And then we have a whole bunch of frames that we really like to use. And so one thing we might want to do at this point is to say, oh wait, we needed more frames. We have now 89 frames. Well, we can certainly use the motion prediction module to make it an interesting transition, a render with the motion prediction, wherever that is. Oh, animated, there it is, animated motion prediction module, and give it. Let's do a dry run first and see whether that gives us an interesting animation. Yeah, that's a good transition. So let's go and perhaps even give it a little bit more refinement pass and go with that. 260 frames will be much better. So what's happening here is that we have now a slower explosion. With perhaps a little bit of side effects, turbulence or some other things introduced from the limitations of the motion prediction module. When things are moving too fast or when topologies are overlapping, that's unavoidable. But actually in this case it might be just fine, because we do want it to look a little bit chaotic and turbulent. So yeah, nothing wrong with that. There's some side effects on the edges. We can blend those out. In fact, how do we do that? If we have, see how there are some side effects on the, look along the edges when I'm animating. You see this, you kind of see them bounce and so on. So something like that you could erase by setting up a rectangle selection, for instance. Let's go with the rectangle to alpha, right? The selection mask. And I don't know, select something like this region. Be somewhat gracious here and don't go too close to the edge. We don't need to be greedy. Let's go selection blur, Gaussian blur alpha, and blur this a little bit so we have a bit more of a transition, not a crisp on or off selection, but a bit of a transition. And now, and in fact you can see that under the alpha, overlay alpha, you can see it's got a little bit of a pink tone. It's difficult to see when the background is black, but it's doing that. And now we need to invert it so that we really select the outer part. The inner part is protected from any drawing or filter effects. And now we apply the filter. Now what's the filter going to be? The filter is going to fade it to black. So we need to, well, one way to do that is to have in the alpha channel a black background, which we do here. So let's go and combine the two together. We can go to the timeline and combine the image that's in the main buffer, that's the entire sequence, with the image that's in the background. That's the black canvas. The swap buffer is currently black. So, and if it wasn't, we would have to make sure it is. We can make that easily. So let's say, and we go to the filter, the timeline, and select the filter that's in the combine group. There it is. Mix the buffers, combine with swap, or multiply. That should probably work just fine. And then that way you see that it kind of blends it out here. It turns black because we're multiplying black from the swap buffer with the whatever colors we have in the main buffer. But we only do that along the edges. The alpha channel is blocking the filter from doing any harm to the pixels on the inside of that. So that's why we inverted it, so that we now have operation just on the outside, on the outer rim. So let's go apply that. And by the way, make sure you have the save undos checked here, so in case you did something wrong here, you can actually undo that. Let's go clear the selection mask, or perhaps we need it later again, so let's store the alpha. We can do that. Here you have a snapshot of the grayscale image of that alpha channel. And let's go clear the alpha and play it to verify that indeed the particles are no longer visible towards the edge. See how now it's fading off. So that's good. Okay, so that's another thing we can do. Now let's see about that explosive. Give it a little bit more motion. It's actually good that we are already in the timeline here. And before we do anything else, we should certainly save this. So I would recommend do a save from the animation menu. That will be a quick memory dump into a DWA file, dog waffle animation, or save it to alpha, save it to AVI. And I highly recommend a lossless codec, such as, for instance, the Lagarif lossless codec. It's free, it's fast, it's highly compressed, really highly recommended. So get yourself the Lagarif codec. You will definitely like to use that if you work with AVI. And let's see now what we can do to give this a little bit more motion. All right, so first of all, there's one thing you could do, and it's kind of a ghosting filter right there. That's in the animated collection on the timeline. The ghost filter will give it sort of a trail as the particles are moving. You'll see if I increase that, you'll see a little bit of a trail, and so it's like a ghost image of where it just was a few frames ago and then a few more later or earlier. And so that gives us a nice little ghosting trail. That's something you can do. Let's go apply it again. Have the save undos. You have one level of undo for the animation. And this is an interesting one, by the way. You see it seems to be going backwards, and that's actually exactly what it does. This filter, the ghost filter, goes from the back end to the front, the last frame to the first frame. So just a little interesting thing about how this algorithm is implemented. You'll see it go backwards, but the sequence hasn't been reversed. It's still doing this. But now you can see that it's got this ghosting. And in fact, let me stop it at a particular frame here, maybe something like this, and then zoom in. I'm doing that with Control Shift and the right button and left button to move around, Control Shift left button to drag around, and right button to zoom in. So now here you can see that there is this ghosting where the particles are kind of bright here and then fade away towards the earlier places where they went through. So that's the ghosting feature. Let's say I didn't want that. I can do undo, one level of undo, and that's why it's great to have that, or it's great to have a DWA file. All right, let's go and save that actually. And when we save it, I'm gonna go, maybe that's a temporary save, temp save. That's the file name I'm giving it here. And I'm going to call that a DWA, so I can always go back to that a little bit later. and didn't ask me for any compression codecs or anything like that. This is a quick memory DWA dog waffle animation. Quick memory dump. Alright, so this I probably don't need anymore. Let's go and actually do a different way. Rather than the ghosting, you might do something a little bit different by using the zoom blur. One of the blur, in the blur groups, there is a zoom blur. And with the zoom blur, the default position is in the center, which we will keep because that's where our particles are emanating from. And this time we'll give it a strong factor. You can see here in the preview that it's doing a strong zoom blur from that hotspot in the center. Set the quality up a little bit higher and apply that. All right. Now maybe actually let's do that. Let's apply it once, but I want to show you what if we want to change the amount of zoom blur. If we want to initially show it's moving fast and then gradually kind of slows down. We want to reduce the amount of zoom blur because towards the end here you can see it's getting dimmer, whereas here it's okay to have a strong zoom blur. So one thing you could do is, let's first undo that, and let's now this time do a strong zoom blur at the beginning. Oh, and by the way, I have one frame here that's non-usable because it's a copy of that's at the end of the motion prediction module. It replicates that last frame, so we probably will want to get rid of that first frame here anyway. So delete that, and let's go and select the first frame and have a very strong amount of zoom factor and quality. Keyframe it, right? And now you can go and reduce the amount of zoom a little bit. Don't have to get rid of it altogether, just keep a little bit of it somewhere around here. And now you have a gradual transition there. You can change that, you can get that hotspot here and change where along that timeline that actually will have reached this value. You can also zoom in here on the timeline to see a little bit more granularity, in a little bit more detail where exactly that is. And let's make it so, and perhaps reduce it even a tiny little bit more, but just not that much anymore. So we now have several keyframes. Let's zoom back out all the way, and we have several keyframes. Oh, I didn't set this one at the right place. This is where I need it. Okay, so let's make it a little bit less keyframes. So we now have 3 keyframes, one here in the middle, one at the beginning, and this one we can actually move also somewhere else. And this one here at the very end, or close to that. So what you can see is that you can do a linear transition or a spline-based transition where it's interpolating smoothly between those different keyframed values. And so that allows you to change the amount of blur, in this case zoom blur, that you're applying. So let's go apply that. And as it's rendering across it, it's also changing the parameters by interpolating them. And so here's now the animation that we've just created. Now we may want to have some sort of a big optical blast as well, like an optical explosion, like a big bright flash. And that's something you can do also with the this filter here, this tool. It's the Nova or the lens flares, but this one is only on a single frame. Right, this one is on the current frame. What we want to do is have that animated across all frames. And so what we'll do is we'll go still with this timeline editor, in case you didn't see where I grabbed it. It's right here, timeline. And I'm going to use now one of the animated filters. At the bottom here, there's a lens flare. It's actually the last one in the list. And with that, you can set a lens flare somewhere. You can set the intensity of it. And we can see the flare settings. There are a couple of presets, quite a number of really great presets, come to think of it. And what I'll do is I'll use one of those, like this one here, grab it and place it right here in the middle. Now this one's a 0 to 100 range for the exposition, kind of a percentage. So 50% is right in the middle. Let's leave it there. But what we can do is change the intensity of it. So we could, for instance, start with something that is barely visible there and start like this, and then just go a notch a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. Just shortly after that we have a big blast, big nuclear explosion, like sort of the Big Bang. Keyframe that, and now it gradually fades away as it's expanding. Right, and then as it's expanding further, maybe it's coming back a little bit. There's, you know, collisions of matter and antimatter, and it's doing a little bit of an erratic thing here. I mean, it's a big bang, for crying out loud. Of course it's going to be chaotic. We just got created here. And let's go and blast it away to just a little dim light at the end. Alright, and so you can always still move these around to other locations if you want them a little bit tighter, fast, earlier in the timeline, in the animation, right? And let's do that, let's try that. So now we are applying this big blast and you have the particles expanding. And there you go. So let's see this. Let's see if we like this. Let's go from the beginning. Oh yeah. Now initially the first frame is already showing the particles. We might want to erase that. And now here's this really cool thing. This is a paint program, remember? Not just an animation or a 3D program with 3D capabilities, and I'll finish with that. But this is a paint program, so let's go just paint over that frame by frame. Let's go to the first, let's go grab the paint brush here. Get rid of the flare options and this preview on the timeline. So let's go paint on here. Wait, what did I just do? Let's undo that. Okay, I don't need a custom brush, I guess. Oh yeah, I still have a custom brush from an earlier thing I was doing. Let's go and undo that. I'm going to right click on my brush tool, or right click or click here on the large airbrush, the brush group selection here. I'm gonna go and select a large airbrush. So now you can just paint on that. Well, it's the white color for primary, so right button will paint on that in black, and that will erase this frame. And then we can go to the next frame, and we already have the light going on here, so that's fine. We have an initial frame in which there is nothing at all. Maybe we need to duplicate this a few times. Let's go back to the frame editor. Right click, remember this, right click here. You can for instance copy just this frame here, copy this frame. Okay, and then insert it right in front of it. Insert before current frame. So we now have 2 times this black frame. Let's do that a few more times. Or if you want, you can select this frame and select this one. Make it a group, right? A block. So select this one, make this the in marker. Make this one the out marker or the out point. So you see a little blue box here that's indicating the range. And that's the block you can copy. Copy this block. Go anywhere in here, maybe the first one, and insert in front of this block. And you now have a few more. Let's scroll here to see them. In fact, if you want to go faster, you select the last one here again, make this the out marker. The in marker is still here at the beginning. Copy this new block, so copy this block and insert it here. Insert the block before the current frame. And so now we have, and let's do that one more time. So we have a few frames you can easily insert that way. Insert block. So now we have a few frames that are black, and when we play this, that gives us a little pause where there's nothing happening, and then suddenly we have this big blast and the expansion. And you know, if you need still some more blur on this, or you need to change maybe the speed, you can work with the frames to compress them, or you can make the whole thing, the whole animation sequence a little bit faster. You could right click here and do a time stretch. Right, and perhaps say instead of 272 frames, you want just 200, and you could make sure that it's doing a frame blending and apply that. Now before I do that, I'm really going to save this. We've done so much here, it would be a shame if we actually got a result that we didn't like in the end. And so let's go and save this again as a quick temp save. We can overwrite this file, or we can call temp save 2, or instead let's go save it as my AVI here. Save AVI, or as an image sequence. If you work with image sequence a lot, that's certainly something you would also want to try. And then I'm going to use the AVI. 30 frames per second is at the speed at which this AVI is supposed to play from here on, and I can go and select where that file is going to be. So this one's going to be, is this the right folder? Yeah, I'm going to call it Big Bang confetti style, right? Because we started with the confetti filter. And that's an AVI file. Let's go and save it, and of course at that point your dialog will show up here where it's asking what codec compressor you want, what compression codec you want. And so I'm gonna use the Lagarif lossless codec. I rarely use Xvid or DivX. It's great to have that for your final publishing, but you know, this is going to be part of another module, so you want it lossless, and you can either have it full frames uncompressed. Not my recommendation, because it's going to be kind of iffy for certain dimensions. If you have odd dimensions like rather than even numbers of pixels in height and width. If you have odd dimensions, that might be a problem for some video playback systems. I think you really will want to get that Lagerrift lossless codec from LeetCode. It's free, it's fast, it's high quality, it's multi-threaded too. You can see the configuration has a lot of options, multi-threading. If you have a multi-core system, use that. It even supports alpha. Now I'm not going to save it with alpha because we don't do that. We don't have an animated alpha channel on this sequence here, so I'm going to keep it RGB, and that's the default. You can also enable null frames. Not recommended that you use that because some systems may not know what a null frame is. Heck, you may not know what a null frame is. So I found out what it is the hard way, so I avoid it unless I really know it's needed, because it's a very long animation and there's only a little bit things moving. But if everything is moving, there are hardly any frames that are identical from one frame to the other, and so there is not really much to gain with having null frames. But it is a very modern codec in that sense, that it does know and uses null frames if it has the ability to do that. And it is a very good codec at many other things. So I'm going to use that and OK that, and now it's rendering it and saving it into an AVI file. So then you can show it with your default Windows Media Player or whatever player you have, and there you are. Here's a nice little Big Bang effect. And of course we might want to add some more glow or flare effects to that. So at that point, have at it. Let's go back to the timeline and see if, for instance, we can go again with that lens flare and place it in here. And maybe we want to have some sort of a weird effect, like a quick swish going through here. We could do that. We could keyframe as something that goes across from here to there and leaves that explosion in the path or in the wake of that passage. So we could have something like going from here, keyframe that, going to about here where the blast is, and at that point it just has reached right there. It has reached the center right there, keyframe that, and then further down at about the same distance here on that, it must have reached the other side. So we continue moving on this, I don't know, whatever that thing is. Maybe that's the fingerprint of God. Maybe that's the finger going, swiping it and leaving a trail, and here's that Big Bang. Look at that. So after that, we don't need this this one here on the right edge, so we fade it away. We reduce the level to nothing and keyframe that, and from here on it's irrelevant as to where that is or how, because it's not visible. You can go and apply that, boom, and we can actually stop the animation, the rendering for the remaining frames, because we don't need any of that anymore. So now we have this little extra animation. Look at that. Let's go play that. Where is the play there? Boom. So we have sort of something that comes from the left. See here, comes from the left, and when it reaches the middle, boom, it ignites something and it keeps going and disappears, but this ignition is now doing its own thing. So here's that animation further modified. It kind of adds a little bit of a distraction on the left, which is great because it, boom, it has something extra to it, something magical, something out of this world. So now, well, yeah, maybe we do want a little bit more ghosting on that, or a little bit more zoom blur, or a shockwave. How about we do a little bit of a shockwave zoom blur here? We could do that again with the timeline. Let's go to the timeline and see some more filters here. We could do a little bit of a distortion on the transform. I'm sure there is a lens effect or wave distort. Oh, that's not it. Still interesting too, but that's not it. There's, I think, oh, maybe it's in the photographic filters there. Yeah, fisheye. All right, so that could be used to create a bit of a bending lens effect, bending effect like that. So you could perhaps have it initially so make it 0, make this parameter 0. Or close enough, let's not be picky if it doesn't. Oh, there it is, 0. It's kind of very tight. So initially we have no lens effect here, and then we have at about here, let's keyframe it all the way to this point, and then we have a strong distortion going to the left, boom, right? And then going back a little bit further. And it's creating a bit of an outer rim glow, and then it's kind of going back this way. And you know, doing this back and forth a few times will give you kind of a headache, but it's gonna make it look like there's something really traumatic happening there. All right, okay, so let's go and apply that. Boom. Okay, and I don't know, do we want to have, yeah, perhaps at the very end even some extra. Well, anyway, that's good enough. Let's see what we've got here now. Some sort of spatial disruption there. And so that's good. That's all I wanted to show you in this quick little intro on some of the animation tools. Of course, I'm never going to finish with that. I'm going to further take it into some other place. First of all, I'm going to save that again as an AVI or DWA and make sure that we have this same name, but this is style 2, another variant of it. Save it again as a Lagerif codec, lossless codec, because you never know, we might need to work with that. It's good to be lossless, to not have any artifacts. And now at this point I'm going to take that, oh yeah, I'm going to use these colors in the swap buffer. Right, so I'm going to make this whole animation that I just saved as an animated swap image, like the open an AVI, selecting number 2, there it is, Big Bang Confetti style 2, and so we now have that also in, open that, we now have that also in the swap buffer. And what that means is that if you combine it, you can see you don't have just something like these colors in the frame in the main image, but you have them also in the swap buffer, which means you can do all sorts of really fun stuff with it in the timeline, where you could go and find combinations. You know, doing subtract, multiply, screen, luminance, difference, all sorts of really fun stuff, compositing. Now, the image in the main buffer is identical to the image in the animated swap buffer at this point, because they are the same animation. So that's not what I need. What I want instead is actually go to the filter, transform, you guessed it, puppy ray. And when I go to puppy ray, the image that's in the main buffer is interpreted as a brightness indicating the elevation. So I can go and perhaps go to a little bit lesser, like medium quality here. Let's delete the keyframes I had from an earlier pass, and I'm gonna go to the last one here, first frame rather, and see what's happening here. It's pretty dark, and we might want to make sure we have a bit more global illumination. And see, it's tiling this entire terrain now. So let's go and go from here and then go to the last frame and maybe move forward a little bit, like so. Let's grab it like this, move up and tilt the head down a little bit so we have a better look at that. Maybe so. So what's happening, let's keyframe that. What's happening now is we are actually going through not just elevation map changes, but also color maps. So the entire animation is being mapped there too. And if we didn't want that elevation, by the way, or if we wanted to change it, much to the contrary, to a higher elevation, we can use a scale here, right? If you are, by default, the Puppy Ray GPU will look like this. You can click on the more and see the additional parameters, and there is a scale parameter here to make it go higher or flatten it down. And in the end, you only see that way. You don't see any elevation map result. You only see the colors changing. Well, I need to make sure I keyframe that Z value here. All right. So, for instance, maybe you want it initially really high, kind of canyons, also bright intensity, and even brighter. I don't know where the light is right now. It's probably hiding here somewhere. Maybe I need to move it around and keyframe that, right? And then at the very end, maybe we don't want these anymore. So let's go and reduce the scale to 0. And you know, while we're at it, let's actually focus on that and zoom in. So I'm gonna go move right over it, tilt my head down, and let's zoom into this one. They're all being tiled and replicated, so let's We can pick any of those. Let's go to this one and zoom right in. There you go. That's good enough. Let's go keyframe that. So we have a bit of an animation transition where it's from a 3D terrain, flattening it down all the way down to just seeing the color channel. And let's go animate that. Make sure we have animate on each frame because each frame is changing. Animate that. I'm going to render that in a hurry, so not the final render quite yet. I'm going to go to high quality though and render that. So now you see the first frame is already rendered, so it makes a bit of a strange side effect. We can certainly will need to delete that first frame, but here we now have an interesting animation with the terrain. Oh, it looks like the terrain caught up with us and we actually were in the mountain there, in the peak for a while. As we're moving around, as the camera is moving around, we're getting a couple of surprises. That's okay. This is art. We can expect some unexpected. And here we get some fancy coloring effects. The elevation is changing. Here we see the stars expanding, interpreting that as an elevation map. See that big bang, that explosion, causing the stars to explode and expand, causing those peaks to basically move apart. And that's going to take a few more seconds. So it's great to have a GPU, by the way, for that. If you're rendering this in software, there is a CPU version of the Puppy Ray. It's going to work too, but it's going to be quite a bit different in terms of the time it takes. So now here we're getting close. We're already halfway done. Remember, we have about 200, almost 300 frames we're rendering here. 272, and some really interesting expansion of the Big Bang of those blobs here, and soon enough we'll be zooming in on the final. We're focusing on that last one on the center as we're moving the camera towards it, and you see it now also flatten it. It's getting less and less in the elevation and it's turning into a very flat display. So this is an example where you can see you can use this Puppy Ray in many different ways. One is to actually do a 3D look, but another one might be sort of still a flat 2D look, but on a 3D plane, and you could perhaps look at it from an angle sideways, but not necessarily give it that that elevated appearance. So here's just finishing that up. And again, the first frame is not going to be usable because that one had already been rendered, and the last frame might also, no, that one's good. There might be some frames in between. If we rendered any frames in between, yeah, like this one. No, this one actually it's because we went into the mountain. The mountain caught up with us. The camera was too low, and the elevation, the peaks kind of caught up with us. Since we didn't check for that, it's not surprising. We have a couple of frames that are dark. But let's see, let's play it. And 2 times we disappear. Now here we go down deep. And really, to finish, I wanted to show you actually this flat look, what you can do with that. You know, if you just want to kind of tile it, replicate it. Let's go again. Let's go first. You know, it doesn't matter what the animation contains. I mean, we could have load AVI. We could load this confetti style too. And we could have it, but it doesn't matter in a way because the swap buffer is the one that contains the colors. This what you're looking at right now. These colors are actually going to be interpreted by Puppy Ray as the elevation map, and instead we now want the color channel alone. So in a way you could even just blank that. You could say, okay, I don't have any of that. Let's go and erase it to white or erase it to black. Doesn't matter. Let's make our 272 frames from that. 272, and let's ignore the fact that there is an elevation, but what we do not ignore is the fact that we have color in the swap channel. Right, so what Puppy Ray is going to have, we still have that because, by the way, we have this animated swap image still checked on here. Make sure you disable that when you're done with the need for this. So but let's go to final render here, transform Puppy Ray like this. And we can go and clear the prior keyframes. And so what I'd like to do really is to select maybe the last keyframe, so we have a little bit of a better look of what it's going to look like, where it's going to be. And let's make it a medium quality to zoom through that a little bit faster. Right now I'm moving actually, so I'm going to select this one to rotate and to change my angle so that I can see the whole thing kind of disappearing into space. Now, maybe I want it not showing this blue sky or whatever sky I have. Right now I have this, let's go maybe the blue sky like this. Maybe I don't want this. Instead I want it to go to the dark sky. But not just on the starry sky here with the moon, not just on the sky, but also on fading into the distance here. So I need, that's the fog color. I need that fog color to be black as well. Let's go select that, really dark. And it's going fast. So what I want to do is put that, oh wait, that's interesting. Probably didn't expect that to happen so quickly, so yeah. What I'll do instead is, you know what, let's keep it something like so. It's probably because it's really far and it's just getting to that dark color quickly. So I'm going to have the intensity, probably doesn't matter so much here. The fog distance, that's a good one to work with. And then the global illumination, that's controlling, that's affecting the brightness of what you actually see here. So give this one a good value there. So now we can keyframe that, and we can go to the first frame, and it will be keyframed at the same angle because we had deleted the prior keyframes. And maybe we'll just I don't know, give a little bit of a difference, a different position here. Like this, and keyframe that, and so now we have an animation where it's going from one to the other and showing that animation being tiled. It's all flat, but it's in the 3D plane on that ground. And let's do a final render on that. So this is the one that we will basically finish off and keep that at the current settings and render. Alright, well this has been a very long tutorial. Thanks for watching through it, and enjoy Dog Waffle 9.1 Howler Edition, and we'll see you in another one very soon.